What's up, YouTube? We're back with another video. My name is Brandon, and today we're going to solve a problem that you and I both have, because we know that we're not always as productive as we'd like to be, and so what we're going to do today is reclaim some of our time by automating a boring task that we might find ourselves doing quite often. And in particular, that task is the process of creating a shortened link from a URL. So by the end of the video, what we'll have is this spreadsheet you see in front of us, where we can paste a link in, and it'll automatically return back a shortened link for us, which I think is pretty cool. We didn't need to log into anything, and we can manage everything in one place. So what we're going to do to accomplish this is creating a custom function that will communicate with a third-party API that will give us back our shortened link and then insert it into the spreadsheet. So that's what we'll spend the remainder of the video doing. If you're only interested in the code, I will provide a link to the finished code in the description below so you can have access to that. But I hope you're excited to get started on this project, because I certainly am. So we'll just dive right in. All right, so here we are in a fresh document with nothing in it except for some dummy data that we'll use to build out our custom function that communicates with third-party API. I'll go ahead and paste in a URL here just so you can see that nothing is returned by the spreadsheet. So this is in fact a blank slate. But the first thing we're going to want to do is find a free third-party API service that will provide us back shortened links for us. I did a quick Google search and I was able to find a GitHub repo that is public that has a list of a bunch of different APIs for free that do various things. It's called Public APIs. So if you're on GitHub, give them a star, show them some love, because this is a pretty helpful resource and you might want to save it for later as well. We'll scroll down here to URL shorteners, which is what we're concerned with. And once we do that, we are presented with a list of various services we can use for free, which is cool. The main differentiator here is the authentication and authorization column, so auth. I wanted to demonstrate auth because it's a common thing that you're going to encounter with third-party APIs, and it doesn't add that much more work, so I figured it is worth including as part of the tutorial. So the service we'll be using is URLBae, because that's a hilarious name, and I'm pretty much choosing it just for that reason alone. That, and it also meets our requirement for authentication and authorization. So we'll begin by creating an account with URLBae by going to their website and then clicking Get Started up in the top right. You fill out the form here, and then you'll be taken to the dashboard. I already have an account, so I'll just log in. And then once we log in, we see the dashboard, and then we go to Tools and Developer API. And then now in the top right of the documentation, we see that we have an API key. And this is kind of like the password that we're going to provide URLBae every time we send them a link to shorten. So this is associated with your account. So keep this private. Don't share it with anyone, because this is like sharing your password. But now we have everything we need to get started building our custom function. So now we'll jump back into our Google Sheet and open up app scripts to get started. So we'll go to Extensions, App Scripts, and that'll open up the editor. Although I'm logged in as a different account, so apparently I need to select the right account. And once I do that, the editor opens and we can begin building our function. And the first thing I'm going to do is rename our function to something a little more descriptive. So we're using URLBae as our service, so why not call this something like Link Shorty, because we want to stay on theme. And next, what we need to do is grab information we'll need from the documentation of URLBae so that we can begin communicating with their service. And the two things we'll need are the API key and the endpoint that we'll be working with to send our links or our URLs to get shortened links back. And over on the left-hand side here, they have an option for links, and so you can see that they have a variety of different actions we can do with links. What we're concerned with is shorten a link, so we'll click that, scroll down to the part of the page that talks about it, and this basically provides a description of how to go about sending links to URLBae so that you can get a shortened link back. So the first thing we need here is our URL that we are going to send our links to. And down below, you'll notice that there's a variety of parameters or options that we can provide that will do things with our links. So we can add a custom domain or an expiration date or something like that. We're not going to deal with any of that. The only requirement is the URL itself, because we're trying to shorten a URL, so that makes sense. The rest of these are optional, so no need to worry about those right now. But the next thing to note here is that we are making this request in the form of a POST request, which is a standard HTTP method for dealing with APIs. Just for a little clarification, if you're unfamiliar with HTTP, whenever we go to a website, we're actually sending what is known as a GET request. And what that means is we're just basically saying, hey, Google, at this address, google.com, send me what you have. And they send back their logo, a search bar, and some other information. But in our case, we want to send some additional information as part of our request. So in this case, it'll be the URL that we want to have shortened. And so in order to send that additional information, we need to make a post request, which is, again, just a standard method for HTTP protocol, which is kind of redundant, I realize. But if you're wanting more information on this, I'll provide a resource in the description below. But let me make sure I have our URL here copied, and then we will jump back over to app scripts and add it to our custom function. So we'll call this API, and then we'll just store this in a string. Next, we'll go back and grab our API key, which is our password, basically. So we'll go ahead and call this API key and store it in a string, and we're good to go. So now we have everything we need for communicating with URLBae. Next, we need to figure out what format URLBae expects to receive the URL in order to shorten it. And we can figure that out by going over to the documentation again really quickly and seeing that they have specified here that they expect JSON format for post request to this endpoint. And on the right-hand side, we actually get a demonstration of what that looks like. So it starts with a curly brace, and then it has a key of URL, and then a value of the URL we want to shorten. And so this is what it needs to look like to them. And this looks very similar to a JavaScript object or dictionary, where we have a curly brace, and then we have some key, and then a value. So we're going to use that because they're very easy to convert into JSON. So we'll go back into app scripts and create a new variable. We'll call this data, and we'll insert some curly braces, insert a key of URL and a value of the URL we want to shorten. Right now I'm going to hard code this as the one we have in our spreadsheet here. So just to test this out and get this working, we'll just use this one link. We will change that in the future, but this should get us started. So now we're ready to set up our actual request that we're going to make to URLBae. To do this, Google actually provides a class that is made available in our code here that we can use to communicate with third-party APIs and services. And that class is called URLFetchApp. So if we jump over to the documentation and scroll down, we can see it offers a number of different methods or functions that we can use to communicate with these external services. And the one we're concerned with is the fetch method. And in particular, we want to look at the one with a params option here because we needed access to the advanced parameters for sending our requests. So we'll click on that, and then we'll scroll down a little bit, and we can see that there is a description of the parameters that it takes in. So there's a URL, which is a string, and then there's a params argument, which is going to be an object. And so if we scroll down a little further, we can see that the params object is actually described here below. So these are the options we can start to update. So we're going to need to update the content type because right now it defaults to this value here. And what we need is application/JSON according to URLBae's documentation. So that needs to be updated. Next, we have headers, and this is where we're going to insert our API key so that we can be authenticated to use URLBae's services. Next, we have method. And right now it defaults to a GET request, which is not appropriate. As we already discussed, we need to make a POST request. And then the payload is where we're going to insert the data that we're sending URLBae. So in our case, that'll be a link that we want to have shortened. So this is where we'll put the link. And then lastly, we have this issue here with escaping. So as I was testing this, I actually had an issue getting this request to send properly because it was escaping characters in the URL, and URLBae apparently didn't expect that. So we need to set this to false. And when I say escaping, what that means is sometimes there are reserved characters that whatever computer is reading the data will take a certain character and do a command, and the // in URLs are one of those characters that need to be escaped often. And so they'll insert other characters to tell the computer, hey, don't read this as a command. This is part of the data. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want anything to be inserted into the URL. We just want to keep the URL as it is so that URLBae receives it in the manner that it expects. So now we know how to set up our request, and we can get to work building out our params object to send the data over to URLBae. We'll start by creating a new variable, and we're going to call it params, just to keep it consistent with URLFetchApp's documentation. And then I'm going to list each of the options we'll be updating first, and then we'll fill them in each one by one. So content type we'll set to an empty string. Then we have headers, which is going to be an object. And then we had method, which is going to be a string. And then we have the payload, which is going to be something that we'll deal with in a second, but right now I'll put it, I'll make it a string. And then lastly, we had the escaping to address that issue I had mentioned, so we'll set that to false to begin with. Next, we will start inserting all of our values for these options. So the first one is application JSON, is exactly what URLBae expects. Then we have a headers, which will be, we need an authorization header. And if we go over to the documentation really quickly, we can see for URLBae, that is, we can see that the header for authorization, it begins with the value of bearer, and then it has the API key afterwards. And this is a standard practice, and this just means it's a bearer token. And so what we need to do is we need to combine these two values together so that it reads as bearer and then the token value. So we'll go back over here, and we're going to use a JavaScript feature called string interpolation, or template literals as they're called in JavaScript. And what that means is it essentially allows us to insert variable values into text or into a string. And so we'll start off with bearer, and then the way we insert a variable is by putting a $sign and then curly braces, and then within the curly braces we can put our API key. And so that takes care of the headers for authorization. So now that we have that in there, URLBae will know that we have an account and we have access to their service. Next, for the method, we will, as we mentioned, we're going to make it a post method. And then for the payload, we are going to insert our data. And we can't just insert our data directly because URLFetchApp expects it to be a string. And so we need to convert our data variable here, which is currently an object, into a string. And the way we do that is by going by typing json.stringify and then our data, passing our data into it. So this will turn our data object here, our data variable, into a string. So that's all we need in order to send a request. And so now we are ready to start sending information over to URLBae. The way we send a request from app scripts is quite simple. So we just need to use our URLFetchApp class that we had discussed earlier, call its fetch method, and then within the fetch method parentheses, what we're going to do is put our arguments for the function. And we can see that in the documentation it's telling us it needs a URL, which is a string value, which right now we have stored in our API variable up at the top here. So we'll just go ahead and put our API in there. And then next it needs an object, the parameters object, which is optional. And we've also named it params. So we'll just call or put the params variable in there as well. And then that's all we need to do to make a request to URLBae. And the cool thing about URLFetchApp is that it'll actually handle the response for us. And when I say that, what I mean is we're sending a request to URLBae with a URL in it, and we expect a response to be a shortened link. And so URLFetchApp is going to handle the response for us. So we want to make sure we store that so we can work with it later. And so we'll store it in a variable called response. And then now we can actually test this out. So I'm going to print out the value of our response after we get it back. And console.log just means it's, as the function runs, it's going to print out the value of our response. And so we can start to read it and see if it's something we can work with, essentially. So we'll click run. And then from there, we can see that it returns an object with some keys and values, and we can't really read anything. It looks like a bunch of function names and then a function value. This doesn't look right. And the reason for that is because URLFetchApp actually returns a class, and the class is called HTTP response here. So we need to use some methods on the response in order for us to be able to even read it. And the one we're concerned with here is get content texts. And so what we'll do is add one more step here. So we'll say that our readable response is going to be our response, but we're going to use that get content text. And then that's all we need to do. And now we should change our print value to our readable response. Let's try running that again. And we should get something that actually is readable. So looks like we got an object with 0 errors, which is good. It has an ID, and it has our short URL, which is cool. The issue here, though, is that it looks like there are some backslashes in our URL when there shouldn't be. And that's the escaping issue that we had discussed earlier. So we want to make sure that we get rid of those slashes because we want it to be an actual link, because right now it would not be a proper link. And so we'll create one more variable here, and we'll call this shorty, because this will be the final link that we have that we're going to insert within our spreadsheet. And in order to do that, to get rid of those characters, what we need to do is say json.get dot parse our readable response. And so right now we can see that we turned it into JSON before we sent it, and then URLBae sent back JSON, and so we're just turning it back into JavaScript here. So this is a pretty common thing that you'll see when dealing with API requests or any fetch requests at all. So let's go ahead and see if our shorty value is looking a little better now. So there we go. We got it back. It looks like a normal URL. So all we need to do is grab this URL out of this object, and we should be good to go. So now, in order to do that, what we can do is access the key value of short URL, and that will return the actual URL that we want. So we should be able to just put in a dot short URL, which is, again, the key value. So if we run that again, we should just get back only the short URL and not the other information. So there we go. We now have our short URL returned from URLBae. Everything seems to be working properly. So all we really need to do now is return our short URL value, which we've called shorty. And that's all we need to do for our link shortening service. There's a couple more functions we're going to need to create, but they're going to be much shorter, and that'll allow us to actually put this value into our spreadsheet. Before we do that, though, I just remembered we need to do a little bit of housekeeping. So right now we have a hard-coded value here for our URL that we're sending to URLBae, and that's not appropriate because right now we're sending the exact same URL over and over, which is not what we want. We want to use it on any URL that we paste into our spreadsheet. And so in order to do that, we will create a new variable here, or a new parameter for our function that it can take in, so that we can feed it any URL that we want, and it'll execute the steps that we've laid out here in this function. And we'll call this parameter URL to shorten, just to keep it clear that this is different than the URL key. And now we'll insert the value that we pass into it as the value for our URL that we're then sending to URLBae. So now we're ready to set up our two other functions. And these two other functions are going to be so that we can deal with the spreadsheet. So these are going to be things that manage activities that happen in the spreadsheet, essentially. And the first one is we need to get the link from our spreadsheet that is pasted. And so we'll call our first function here get link. And then I'm just going to put the curly braces and leave it empty for now. And our second function is going to be insert link, because we want to keep things separate. We don't want a giant function that handles all these things. We want to separate our concerns here. So we'll call this insert link, and then insert our curly braces and leave that blank. Okay, so in order to fill in these functions, what we need to do is use a new class that Google provides that gives us access to the spreadsheet that we're working in. And Google provides that as a class of spreadsheet, for lack of a better term. And this class is much larger than any of the ones we've worked with so far. So if we scroll down here, we can see that the list of methods here is quite extensive. So pretty much anything you'd want to do in a spreadsheet, you have a method for it. So we're not going to dive into any of these and go through like what it returns and what the parameters are like we did with the other classes. But I'm just going to kind of walk through my thought process on how I went about achieving the result we're looking for, and hopefully that will make enough sense. So the first thing we're going to do is grab our spreadsheet, which I'm going to store in this sheet variable. And we're going to do this by calling our spreadsheet class, spreadsheet app class, and then we're going to say get active spreadsheet. And then we're going to chain another method on here, get sheet by name. And so this is going to allow us to grab the tab within our spreadsheet. And so we got to pass the name in here. And the name is, if we go back to our spreadsheet, sheet 1. So we want to put that in there. And so this means that now our spreadsheet tab is stored in this sheet variable. And so now, in order to read the values of that spreadsheet, we need to declare a range, is what Google calls it. And so this will select the data within the spreadsheet itself, or that tab itself. So we're going to reference our sheet variable, and then we're going to say get data range, and then call that method. And so that's going to have all the data within our spreadsheet selected now. And then now what we can do is get the values, because there's a lot of attributes associated with this get data range. So there's other things aside from the spreadsheet values that are in this range variable right now, but we only want the values. And so this will be, we'll call this like sheet values. and then we're going to reference our range there, and we're just going to call get values. And that'll give us the values of our spreadsheet. So we can actually print this out just to make sure we get the appropriate values. So we'll call this sheet values, and then go over to our spreadsheet just to remind ourselves what's in there. So we have a header with name, raw link, shorten link, and then one record with a description and a URL. So we should see that in the console when we run this. And so we'll go ahead and run our function, and we get back our header that we just saw, and then also the values that we just saw. So all we want, we're getting the link right now. So this is the function get the link. So every time we paste a link, we want to grab that from the spreadsheet. And so that's the value we need right here. And in order to do that, so one thing to point out is that the return value of sheet values is going to be a two-dimensional array. And what that means essentially is if I just create a placeholder array. So an array is a list of values or a list of data essentially. So it could be like numbers, and we could add some text in there. But a two-dimensional array is an array within an array. So there's an outside list and then there's an inside list. And so I can have multiple arrays within this array, for instance. And the way that this is represented for our spreadsheet is that each array within the main array is going to be a row, and then each value within that is a cell within the spreadsheet. And so in order to access this, we need to use JavaScript's notation for accessing an array. So if I was going to do that with our placeholder right now, it would be something like array at index 0, and that would grab us our first row here. And then if I wanted to get this number 2 value within that row, I would need to insert another square bracket with the number 1 in it. And because the way this works is that so each object or each array within here, they start at counting it at position 0. So this is at position 0 is this first row. Position 1 would be the next row. If we had another array in there, that would be position 3. So that's why we are referencing the 0 here. And then the 1 is going to reference the second position. So within this smaller array, the position 0 is this 1 value, position 1 would be this 2 value, and so on and so forth. So just be aware that when we're getting stuff inside of lists, that it's 0 index, which could be a little counterintuitive sometimes. So in order to get the values, the URL that we're looking for from our sheet values, we will store that in our link variable that we'll call it. And so we'll say sheet values, and then we'll put our square brackets, and then we always want the last link that has been pasted. And so that's like the last row, basically. And so since this first square bracket right here is going to access the row, we always want the last one. So we're going to actually calculate the sheet values dot length, and that's going to tell us how much stuff is in our sheet values, so how many rows are in there. And then we want to subtract 1 because that'll be the last index for the last row, essentially. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but basically we're just getting the length of our spreadsheet. If there's 20 links in there, for instance, then it'll provide 20, but since indexes are 0 indexed for grabbing stuff from an array, we need to subtract 1 because the last item, even if there's 20 items in the array, the last index for the array will be 19 because it's 0 indexed. Hopefully that helps kind of describe things. And then next we need the column that we're grabbing from. And in this case, it'll be our second column, which is our number 1 index. And so this should give us back only our URL that we paste. So in always the last one that we paste in. So let's go ahead and see if we can print out our link. And it looks like it's working properly. So we're just grabbing the link alone. And so this is what we can actually send over to URLBae every time we paste a new link in. So we're going to go ahead and return our link because we want to be able to use that value when we pass it over to our other functions. Next, we're going to work on our insert link function, which is going to be very similar to get link. Instead of getting the link, though, what we're going to do is we're going to be putting a link inside. And one thing I should point out before diving into that is that I did comment out between edits the link shorty function here, which I can do on at least on Mac with command \. or forward slash rather. So command forward slash will either comment out or uncomment something. And the reason I did that is because I don't want this function running every time we click run. So I just commented it out so it will not run. And yeah, so that's pretty much all we needed to clarify there. But since we're dealing with the same spreadsheet, we're going to copy over our sheet variable so that we get the same spreadsheet here. And then what we need is our last row in the spreadsheet, because we're grabbing the last item that or the last URL that we paste into the spreadsheet. So we want to make sure that we put the link in the same row. And so we'll call this last row. And this is going to be a method that we can use that will return a number for us, and it's called, we'll use it on our sheet here, our sheet variable. So it'll be get last row, and that'll return a number. So if we have 26 rows in our spreadsheet, it'll simply just return the number 26. And so what we need to do now is actually get the cell that we're pasting into. And the way we do that is in spreadsheets is like A1 or B2 or something like that. And so we need that same syntax here. And the way we do that is we're going to grab our column. So we want column C here. And so this will be the cell location is what we'll call this. And we're going to use string interpolation here because we always want the last row to be dynamic based on how many rows are in the spreadsheet. And so we're going to use our backticks, and then we're going to insert C because we want to insert the link into column C. And then we're going to use our notation here for inserting the last row variable into that. So this will be something like C26 or C23, just how many rows we have in our spreadsheet. This will always be up to date essentially. So now we want to actually select the cell that we are working with. And the way we tell Google Sheets that we're going to select the cell is with the sheet, a reference to our spreadsheet, .get range, and this is going to make our cell location the active cell. And so again, the cell location is something like C2 or C3, and we're just going to tell Google Sheets to select that cell so that we can insert something into it. Next, what we have is our call to our other functions. And I'm going to uncomment out the link shorty function just so we can use that here. And now we'll store our link, we'll grab the link, and we'll do that by calling our getLink function that we've already set up. We'll call that, so this will always grab the link, and it's going to return the value of that link, so we can store it here in this value, which we're calling link. And then now what we can do is we can call our link shorty function and pass in the value that the last link that was pasted into the spreadsheet. And we do that by passing in our link variable. Now, all we need to do is reference our cell here, which is currently selected, and we need to set the value of the cell with the shortened link that we are storing in this variable called shorty. So this should all now work as expected. And I guess it's time for the moment of truth, and we're just going to run this and see what happens. So we want to make sure to select the appropriate function that we're running. So we're now running our insert link function, which is the last function here. So this insert link function uses both of the functions we've already created, and so it'll run through all of the steps that we've gone through here today. So I'll click run. Okay, it looks like everything completed. If I go back to the spreadsheet, this is the moment of truth. Look at that. Our shortened link is now inside of our spreadsheet. And the only thing that we need to finish off our automation is to set up a trigger for when this function should run. So we'll go back to our editor and then go over here on the left-hand side and click the little clock icon that says triggers. And then we'll set up a new trigger where we want to choose the function that's running. So we don't want link shorty because that just communicates with URLBae. We want insert link, which puts it all together. And then we select the event type for when this should run. And for our purposes, we'll say it's on edit, I guess. I'm not sure what the difference is between on change and on edit. I probably should have looked that up. But on edit seems to work. And I'll click save there. And then I'll just go over here and refresh this page just to make sure that everything has been updated. And then I'll grab a random URL and I'll paste it in. And it should run automatically. Look at that. So that completes our link automation project. I hope you had fun building this with me, and if you did, please smash that like and subscribe, and you will be one step closer to becoming an automated robot of some kind. Thanks.